Hey, how are you doing? Welcome to Sunday School for this week. Unfortunately, Gracie couldn't make it because she's not feeling too great, but hopefully by the time you see this, she'll be feeling a whole lot better. This week, we're going to be looking at John chapter 20. You may notice a bit of a difference. I'm at my parents' house in Chattanooga, hence the change in decor, but hopefully the fish are doing great. I always get a lot of questions about the fish tank. This week, we're looking at John chapter 20, and we got a big story. It's the resurrection. So we've been waiting for this for the whole book of John, pretty much. So at this point, if you want to stop and read through the chapter and take a couple minutes, and we'll put the questions on the screen, and then once you've read through it, then we'll look at the passage together. All right, so hopefully you've read through the passage. Not super long this week, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on, right? A whole lot of little stories, kind of episodes in this one. So our first question was a little bit factual. How many times do you see Jesus in the passage? How many times is he seen? Does he come back? There's all these different stories. Let's just run through them real quick. There's the first one where there's this woman, Mary Magdalene, who sees him with several other women, and then they run and they go with Peter and they see Jesus. Then there's the second time where he appears just to her, and they have this little conversation in the garden, and he says some typically mystic sort of Jesus sounding stuff. And then there's the time where he appears to all of the disciples in verses 19 through 23. And that's the bit where Thomas comes in. You might remember this, doubting Thomas. And he comes in and he's like, well, are you sure? I don't really believe that Jesus is really back from the dead. I know he followed them and stuff, but that seems a little bit crazy. And then he comes in and wants to see the holes and everything. And then there's the last bit where John kind of tells us in verses 30 and 31 kind of why he's been writing all of this down. So I guess I kind of answered my question, but why do you think John has so many of these sightings recorded? Why do you think he's, bothering to tell us? He's telling us the story, as we've been looking at, in a very specific way. Why is he telling us the story in this way? Well, I think it's because what he tells us in verses 30 and 31, that there's a whole lot more he could be telling us, but that he's telling us so that we can see, so that we can believe as if we were really there. And he's really intent on making sure that we understand that Jesus really did die with physical blood and water, as he showed us last time. And then he really did come back with real holes in hands and his feet and real scars. Something that maybe for us, when we think about Jesus, we kind of picture this whole story in our head, kind of like we would a movie or a story that maybe we read about. But it's kind of hard to picture it as if it's real, the thing that really happened. And John's really concerned that we understand that there's an actual eyewitness account of what went on. At least that's my thought. So question number 2. We kind of already got into it, but what did you have? Why did John say that he wrote this? And then has he achieved it? He says in verse 30 that Jesus did all this stuff, a whole lot more than is written in this book, but they're written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So, this is the simple part. This is really questions 2 and 3. Do you believe it? You've read the whole book now, or almost. We've got one more chapter left. And when we sit here and pause and think about this, I think this is a challenge all of us need to face ourselves with maybe a little more often when we read the Bible. Not just do we know what's in it, or maybe do we understand why it's there, how it's happening, and all the little details, but do you actually believe it? Are you actually reading this as if it's not just some weird book we study on Sundays, but actually true fact that really happened? Have you really believed this? And not just maybe textually too, but do you believe that he's the Christ? There's tons of folks in the story who didn't have any question about believing that Jesus was real, but at the same time, they didn't believe that he was who he said he was. And so for us, there's this twofold challenge. Do we believe that the story is true in the first place? And then, do we believe that Jesus is actually who he said he was? We've talked about that several times, right? There's C.S. Lewis's favorite, his little trilemma, that's what it's called, that Jesus is either a liar or a lunatic or Lord. That for him to claim that he's the Son of God, he's either got to be lying through his teeth, he's either got to be crazy, or maybe he's actually who he says he is. And there should be this challenge, I think, when we read this kind of passage for each of us. We each, and maybe every time we read it a little bit, are challenged with this, do you really believe this? I know especially for a lot of our middle school students, maybe like me when you were growing up, it's something that you've grown up in the church. You've grown up, always just assuming, of course, I'm a Christian, and yet maybe you're starting to question that. Maybe you're starting to wonder, is this really something that I want to own, my own faith? And John has written this for a very specific purpose, that we would believe. And then the other question I asked, hopefully you thought about this for a minute in verse, the third question is, what does it really mean to you? If Jesus has really died, and he has really come back from the dead with all these little specific sightings that John bothered to record for us in chapter 20, all of these holes in his hands and his feet, and the linens wrapped up, and the angels and Peter running, and this real living, breathing Jesus who is really sweating and really eating and really drinking and really physically human, probably needed his haircut too at some point. If you believe that, what does it mean for you? Does it mean that you're going to follow him? Does it mean that you're going to be like these disciples, ready to live for him, ready to leave what you had planned for tomorrow, what you had planned for your life? Or does it mean that you're going to be like some of the other folks we've read about in the Gospel of John, who see Jesus, who even see his miracles, and yet don't follow him? There's this really dramatic moment going on in our society right now where we're having a whole lot of protests, right? We're having a whole lot of social unrest and a whole lot of injustice and frustration and all kinds of great stuff. It's not a happy time really for anybody at the moment. And one of the big questions, at least that I keep seeing thrown around on social media, is, what are you actually going to do about it? How are you, if you're, a white person, how are you going to fight racism in your life? There's not a whole lot we can do, but what exactly are you going to do about it? And if this is something that upsets you, maybe you should do what you can at least. Well, the same is true about this book, right? The question that maybe some of us have been faced with in the last couple weeks is what are you going to do about Jesus? If he is really the Son of God and he really put on flesh and moved onto earth and died for not just the sins of the world, but for your sins specifically, that asks and challenges you and me to live in a different way, to say, okay, the things that I had planned for my life don't matter as much anymore. It's instead, what does Jesus want for me to do? And I know, as cheesy as that might sound, there is a ton of freedom and a ton of joy in that. Because as you, like the folks that we're going to see in the story next week, as you surrender your life to Christ, you get to leave behind the life that you've been chasing after. We talk about this at youth group a lot, right? How the things that we are pursuing are often not actually worth very much, right? And then we'll see this in the story next week. The disciples, after this is all over, go back to fishing. They go back to their life basically as blue-collar workers, which there's nothing wrong with that, but they go back to this life where they're just back fishing again, and they're kind of like, well, what happens now? And Jesus comes and he authorizes them, and he gives Peter this mission, to go and feed his sheep. We'll talk more about that next week, but the challenge for us is you might have things that you're looking forward to, and those might be really, really good things, and you should keep, whether it's football or sports or friends that you can't wait to see and spend time with over the summer. Those are all wonderful things, and you should really pursue those. And yet there's this freedom that comes with ultimately following Jesus, that if one of those things falls through, if you don't quite get the position that you're looking for, if that girl you're talking to, things don't work out, there's this big hope and this big promise that actually you're here for a whole lot more than just that. And Jesus is offering that to each of us. So we'll talk more about that next week. I hope you guys have a great week, And hope you're challenged by John's little challenge here at the end of the book, that this is written for a purpose, not just for people to believe, but so that you may believe, in verse 31. And so the challenge this week is, do you? And if you do, what does that mean for you? How does that change your life this week? Hope you have a great week, and hopefully we'll see you next week for Sunday school, and maybe the week after that for the outdoor movie. All right, talk to you later.